Okay, we're here at the gravesite of Nicholas Biddle. It's at 9th and Laurel Street in Pottsville, way in the back of the AME Bethel Church graveyard. And we're here today because today is April 18th. And on April 18th, 1861, this man here, Nicholas Biddle, became a local legend and certainly a hero. Very little is known about the life of Nicholas Biddle. He was born a slave in Delaware around 1796, but he escaped to freedom by way of the Underground Railroad. But when exactly he slipped the chains of human bondage is not known. Historians do not know where Biddle first settled upon arriving in Pennsylvania. And for that we have two different accounts. One account contends he settled in Philadelphia, where quite possibly he was taken in by abolitionists, after which he found employment as a servant in the home of Nicholas Biddle, the wealthy Philadelphia financier and longtime president of the Second Bank of the United States, whose name the escaped slave adopted as his own. Now here we have a photo of Nicholas Biddle, okay? Here's what Nick looked like later in life. And also we have a photo here of, or a sketch here, of Nicholas Biddle, the financier, okay, and banker from Philadelphia. So there's what he looked like. Now, so according to that account, Biddle, the banker, along with his servant, Nick Biddle, traveled to Mount Carbon, where he attended a dinner on January 18th, 1840, at the Mansion House in Mount Carbon, with several dozen capitalists and industrialists to celebrate the successful smelting of iron by anthracite. For whatever reason, Biddle, the servant, remained behind in Pottsville while his employer returned to Philadelphia. I have a sketch here also, I'll show you in a second. Okay. Well, this is a photo of the Mansion House in Mount Carbon, okay? The famous Mansion House at Mount Carbon, built around 1829. It attracted many crowned heads of Europe and the wealthy people of Philadelphia in its heyday, while Mount Carbon was a summer resort. Okay, so that's the first story. The second story as to how Biddle got his name is that he escaped slavery and settled in Pottsville, where he found employment at the Mansion House and witnessed the January 1840 dinner celebration. If this is true, something about Biddle, the banker, rubbed off on Nick Biddle, and it was then that he adopted the banker's name. Whatever the case, by 1840, Nicholas Biddle had made his Pottsville his home, taken up residence in a modest dwelling on Minersville Street. He took an active interest in the city's two militia companies, the National Light Infantry and the Washington Artillery, whose members he quickly befriended. Because he was black, Biddle was prevented from being mustered in as a soldier. Not to be deterred, he marched off to war as an orderly, which is really an attendant to an officer, of Captain James Wren. I have a photo here I'll show you in a second of Captain Wren. Bear with me. There's Captain Wren. Okay. And Wren was the commanding officer of the Washington Artillery, okay, part of the local militia. Biddle had been associated with the company since its formation in 1840 and was so highly regarded by Wren and members of the Washington Artillery that he was considered one of their own and even permitted to wear the company's uniform. That's important for later. When Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the Southern Rebellion, the men of Schuylkill County responded immediately. They boarded trains bound for the nation's capital. These men became known as the First Defenders. Traveling to Washington, D.C., the First Defenders first had to go through Baltimore. And that's kind of where the story begins as far as the wounding of Biddle. Now this is a map of Baltimore, okay? This is Bolton Station. This is where the train would have been coming down from Harrisburg. Just short of Bolton Station is where the train stopped. The men on board, the First Defenders, had been warned there was going to be trouble in Baltimore. So they stopped just short of Bolton Station and debarked. Now, the problem is you couldn't go through Baltimore on train. You had to stop at Bolton Station, and then you had to travel down the streets of Baltimore, down Pratt Street to Camden Station to board the B&O Railroad to head to Washington. So you had to debark the train and march through town. And of course, that's where the trouble was going to begin. See, Baltimore is a secessionist city at the time, okay, pro-Southern. And people have been aware that there were troops coming. So, essentially, Baltimore was considered a hostile city. In Baltimore, the first offenders ended up in a hive of aggression as a mob of 2,000 some people moved in on them. They had been angry enough that when the Pennsylvania militiamen had detrained just before Bolton Station and began marching down Utah Street toward Camden Station. The angry citizens of Baltimore were spoiling for a fight and picked up whatever weapons and projectiles they could find. Captain Thomas Yeager was extremely concerned, as he expected, quote, an intended massacre in Baltimore, unquote. When the first defenders first arrived, they were met by Union troops under the command of Lieutenant General John Pemberton. But he only took them halfway through the city. The rest of the way, the defenders were escorted by Baltimore police, many of whom were assumed to be of secessionist leanings. When the angry crowd saw Nick Biddle, an African-American in uniform, okay, in a blue uniform, who was treated as an equal by his white comrades, their bloodlust only increased and their calls grew louder. Soon began the chants. Now they were using the N-word, I'm going to switch it to Negro, and they were yelling, "Negro in uniform, Negro in uniform," as the crowd, built up in anger. Captain James Wren, Biddle's commander, later wrote, quote, "Poor Nick had to take it as the mob closed in like wild wolves. The mob pried bricks loose from the streets. Biddle soon was the target of more than just oaths, as salvos of bricks and bottles began to fly through the air. One struck Biddle in the head, knocking him to the ground, leaving a wound that reportedly exposed bone. Others in the crowd were also hit. Private Ignaz Gresser, he was a German immigrant. He suffered from a painful ankle wound. Private David Jacobs had a fractured left wrist and broken teeth. When the engineer of the train stepped in, the mob tried to knock the locomotive off the tracks. Battered and bruised, the first defenders did get on the train and arrived in Washington, D.C. later in the day. Many believe Biddle was the first man to be struck down by an enemy combatant in the Civil War. Yet Biddle remains an overlooked and almost entirely forgotten figure in the Civil War's rich history. At the time, however, Biddle even received the attention of Abraham Lincoln as the president visited the militiamen being housed at the U.S. Capitol on April 19th. Lincoln wanted to thank the men who had arrived to defend Washington after he had called for the 75,000 volunteers. The president learned the Pennsylvanians had been attacked while traveling through Baltimore en route to the Capitol. But while it was the frail 65-year-old Biddle wearing the uniform of the Washington Artillery, his head wrapped with blood-soaked bandages that caught the especial attention of President Lincoln. Biddle refused the president's advice to seek medical attention, insisting he preferred to remain with his company. Now, the following day, back in Baltimore, the Pratt Street riot occurred. The 6th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment was taking the same route as the first offenders, and they retaliated by firing on the Baltimore rioters. By the end of the incident, 4 soldiers and 12 rioters were dead. As for the Union soldier who was the first to spill blood, Nicholas Biddle was unable to enlist for the Union. Troops of color were not admitted into the U.S. Army until May 1863, with the establishment of the United States Colored Troops. Biddle would return to Pottsville and passed away in 1876 at age 82.
So in the last video we talked about Nicholas Biddle grave, which is located up at the top of 9th and Laurel. So now here we're at the Nicholas Biddle School, which is one of the schools that were named after him in the Pottsville school system. And currently now the Nicholas Biddle building is now a child development center. I was once a kid that went here for preschool, but before it was a daycare and taken over by child development, it was actually an elementary school in the Pottsville school district system. from K through 4th grade. But with the building of Jonas Clark, it is now a preschool and daycare center.
Okay, now we're in Garfield Square in downtown Pottsville, and this is a marker now we're going to show you. Let's get up close here, Parker. Zoom in on it. On April 18th, 1851, it was the 90th anniversary of the First Defenders' March through Baltimore. The residents of Pottsville dedicated this bronze plaque, which was placed on the Civil War Soldiers Monument, okay, here in Garfield Square. And it says, in memory of the first defenders and Nicholas Biddle of Pottsville, first man to shed blood in the Civil War, April 18, 1861. Okay, now we're up on the corner of Nickel Street and North Center, across some maroons. And then we're gonna look now at a mural, okay? There's a mural on the wall here, and of course featured prominently in the middle is Nick Biddle, okay? So he's one of the people we feature on our Pottsville mural here. And I'd like to conclude with a quick excerpt from the poem called The Grave of Nick Biddle by Chaplain Guthrie. The grave of Nick Biddle a Mecca should be to pilgrims who seek in this land of the free. For there lies a brave man distinguished from all, in that his veins furnished the first blood to fall. And that concludes our video about Nick Biddle today, April 18th.